Hello, Algebra 1. Tonight's video lesson is going to be a little bit different than some of the others because it's not going to be based on the textbook. Instead, I'm going to step back and talk a little bit about what algebra is all about. And I'm going to start by talking you through this example. You remember that after the quiz I gave you this age puzzle. And you put in your current age as step 1, and it had 5 steps in total, and by the final step you had subtracted 10, and you got a result. Well, let's in fact look at exactly how one of the students did this. He put in 14 as his age, then he added 5 like he was supposed to in the second step and got 19. Then he multiplied that by 2, and the third step's result was that he had 38 now. Now the fourth step was the confusing one to many of you. You were supposed to subtract twice the age that you started with. So in this case, you subtract twice 14. In other words, you subtract 28. So 13 minus that 28 gives you 10. That last step was to subtract 10, and that student ended up with 0. And then you were supposed to look at somebody older than you. So one of the students gave me the age 52, and added 5, got 57. Multiplied that by 2 and got 114. And remember, this is that confusing step. You multiply the first amount, 52 in this case, times 2, that was 104. 114 minus 104 is 10. You subtract that 10 off, and again you get 0. So then I asked you to look at somebody younger than yourself. One of the students gave me the age 6, and this is how it ended up working for that student, working from 6, and again ended up with 0. So each time you ended up with the same result, even though you started from a different place and followed the same recipe each time. And somehow, no matter where you started, if you followed the recipe, you always ended up in the same place. And I asked you why. And several of you came up with some thoughts about that. Now, in some classes we got farther along than others, but in one class we got to this point where we said, okay, well, let's use a placeholder for our starting point, because it doesn't seem to matter. We could start anywhere. So let's just call that starting point age. Or in this case, remember, we're using algebra, we're using variables. So in place of the word age, we use the variable a. And the second step is to add 5. So there we have 8 plus 5. And then we multiply that by 2. And we talked about this in some of the blocks. You multiply the whole thing times 2. So it's 2 times, put parens around it. It's the whole thing that you're doubling. Now from that, you're supposed to subtract twice as much. This is that confusing step, so there we'll just bring this down as a starter and keep that there, and we're going to subtract off twice your age. Well, in fact, it's actually easier now when you're talking about it with variables. You're just subtracting off 2a. You're doubling that, that's 2a, and subtracting it away. Well, now this is where some blocks got far enough along that we were able to say, if you go ahead and multiply that 2 times both these things, 2 times a is 2a, 2 times 5, well, there's that 2 times 5. But notice, we've got 2a over here, and remember, we subtracted off 2a over here. So now we're just left with the 2 times 5. That's all we had. If you subtract off the 10, well, 2 times 5 is 10. So every time, you're going to end up with 0 at the bottom. Why? Because you're starting with a, but all the way through, if you get down to step 4, step 3 rather, you ended up getting 2a, and in step 4 you subtracted that 2a off. So the recipe had you make 2a and then take 2a away. What it left you with was 10, and the last step was to subtract the 10 away, and you'll always end up with 0. Okay, let me remind you that we talked earlier in the month about this idea that algebra is a language for describing patterns. And you might remember the story I told you about the cheeseburgers, and how I said the first time I entered the kitchen there were 6 cheeseburgers, but every time I came back 3 had been eaten. And I showed you this picture. And I said this language for describing patterns can be communicated, can be used in at least 5 different ways. And we're going to talk during the course of the year about each of these 5 different ways. We'll talk about word stories, like I originally said about the cheeseburgers, but we'll also talk about pictures. And in fact, just going back, I can turn the words into pictures if I want to. But there are also three other modes: tables, graphs, and equations. And here's an example of a table. Here's an example of a graph. We didn't really talk about an example of an equation. Well, let's put this news story in place of this story about cookies. Let's put the story about age in there. And I've kind of simplified it down so it would fit in the space, but it says exactly what I gave you as instructions. You start with your age, add 5, multiply by 2, subtract twice your age, then subtract 10. That set of words we did actually end up turning into an equation. Oops, right here. Okay, so let's talk about how to kind of condense all of these steps down into a nice, neat equation. What we have here, if we put these last two pieces together, we've got 2a plus 2 times 5. Right here, 2a plus 2 times 5. That's what you got coming out of step 3. Minus 2a, that's what you get from step 4, minus 10. So again, 2a plus 2 times 5, that's what you guys did really in step 3. Minus the 2a, that's what you did in step 4, minus the 10, that's what you did in step 5. I've consolidated all of that down into a single equation. So, well, into a single expression, I should say. Let's make it an equation, though. Remember, it always turned out to be 0, but let's say that really what we were looking for was, what is the result? Question mark equals, in other words, 2a plus 2 times 5 minus 2a minus 10. Or, instead of question mark equals, we'll call it y equals. So now our equation for the age puzzle is this here, and we can paste that right in here into this table that I have here, into this grid that I have. So the story about age, which always turns out to be 0, can be changed into an equation about age, where I had to use a different letter here because I'd already used age. So your answer, instead of using a for answer, your answer is y. But y is equal to this formula that you guys kind of came up with as you went through the steps and started noticing there's a pattern here. Every time I start, no matter where I start, I always end up in the same place. Okay, well, speaking of patterns, I'm going to give you a new story to identify the pattern for, and that's actually going to end up being your homework tonight. So let me talk you through this one and you'll see what I mean. Imagine you had a set of toothpicks. Imagine you're sitting at your kitchen table after you've watched your uncle eat all those cheeseburgers, and there's no food left, and you don't have anything else to do but play with the toothpicks that happen to be sitting out on the table, and you arrange them in the shape of a triangle. And you decide, you know what? I'm not going to call those toothpicks a triangle. I'm going to call it a mountain. And this story is about mountains made of toothpicks. And notice how many toothpicks that you've used. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you decide, well, you know what? I'm going to be artistic with this. I'm going to make another mountain behind that one. It'll be a cascade of mountains. So here's my first mountain, and here's my second one, kind of hiding behind the first. If you've ever seen the Cascade Mountains in Washington State, they often are photographed in this style with one behind the other. All right, so now you go ahead and you make a third mountain. 1, 2, 3. But notice that the second and the third mountains required fewer toothpicks than the first one, because the first one's in front. It's got all of the toothpicks. The second and third, you didn't need as many toothpicks to show the shape. Okay, I've gone ahead and shrunk or reduced the size of that picture of the toothpicks down so that it would fit in our grid here. And your assignment tonight, in other words, your homework tonight, is to turn this picture. I've already given you the picture. Actually, I've already given you the words as well. So turn the words, the story about the toothpick mountains, and the picture of the toothpick mountains into one of two things. You can either turn them into a table, kind of like this one, but this is not the right table for toothpick mountains, or into an equation, kind of like the equation that we had for age, but this is not the right equation for toothpick mountains. So all you have to do is one of the two. Again, combine the picture and the words I've given you, make either a table, a lot like this, or an equation, a lot like the one that we made for the age puzzle. Bring that into class and your homework will be all done.